Our first speaker is Dr. Charlotte Bosseaux. Dr. Bosseaux is originally from France. She graduated with a major in English from Université de Provence, France, and then received her degrees in English literature from the same university. She also holds a Master of Science in Translation Studies from the University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology, UK, and a PhD in Comparative Literature / Translation Studies, University College London, UK. She worked as a lecturer in Translation Studies at UCL and as a freelance technical translator. Since 2004, she has been working at the University of Edinburgh. Dr. Bosseaux is the author of How Does It Feel? Point of View in Translation, published in 2007, a corpus-based research into how the point of view is created in the original, namely Virginia Woolf's novels, and how it is adapted in French translations. She's currently finishing a book to be titled Uncanny Encounters that will integrate film studies, linguistics, and voice analysis. I had a chance to listen to Dr. Bosseaux speak on research methods in audiovisual translation at the University of Edinburgh 2 years ago, and I felt very jealous of her students who had the chance to work with her on a daily basis. Today, we are lucky to have her at our conference. Please welcome Dr. Charlotte Bosseaux.
I'm going to try to speak from here. Can you all hear me? Do I need to speak up? Is it fine? Yes? Because I'm too short for this. You wouldn't see me like going there. Okay? Do I need the mic? Or I'm going to... I feel multi-class. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So, first of all, I wanted to thank Tiziana for inviting me today to speak here. Last year, when she invited me, I was very pleased to accept, and I'm even happier to be here at the present time in Ukraine with everything that is going on. So thank you very much for coming today to hear us speak. On a lighter note, I think today is International Happiness Day, so I want to wish you happy moments with us in Ukraine, and it's also the equinox. I think it's the best time to have a conference. So I hope that spring is going to bring us many good things, particularly in the current situation that Ukraine is at the moment. So my presentation today, if this works, it does work, is for rethinking dubbing research. I'm not going to rethink the whole field of dubbing research because that would be a little bit presumptuous, but I'm going to take you through my research journey into the field of dubbing. Because I'm from France. France is a dubbing country in the same way as Ukraine is a dubbing country, and when you get used to a particular style of audiovisual translation, I think it makes you think about films and translation in a particular way, and that's what I want to do in my research. So first of all, a little bit on dubbing from the audiovisual translation perspective. Recently, Frédéric Charmet published this book called Audiovisual Translation Dubbing that has everything you ever wanted to know about what is happening in dubbing. Not only from a European perspective, but from a wider, worldwide perspective. And I'm not going to take you through everything that happened in dubbing, but some of the key, what I think are the key events or research that has been done. So at first, we, in the translation, audiovisual translation research, we looked at lexicalization better? Yes. Technicalities. Good. So media constraints, yes, I can hear myself too. Amazing. I feel I have to speak like that, but that's what you have to do with short people. Perfect. Perfect. Thank you. What do I need to do now? I need to speak like that. No, I don't do that. So, media constraints. So, focus on lexiconization. We know what is lexiconization. Synchronizations of mouth movement and the words that is coming out of the mouth of the actors. Kinetic synchrony. So, we're talking about body movement and the synchrony between the movements and what people are actually saying. And isosynchrony, which has to do with matching the duration of the translation with what people were saying in the original. So there are quite a few people that have been writing on that, from Chavez to Agos to Whitman-Vinson, and this is what people at first focused on. Then we moved on a little bit more to what are divided as word level and beyond word, but it's not only about words. So there's a lot written on humor, dialect, so how do you translate humor across cultures, particularly in dubbing, dialects, what is the best way of translating, for instance, Scots, if you are translating into Italian, for instance, dubbies, because we all know that the language that is used in dub film is not really the way we speak in reality. And multilingualism, which has become one of the main, is a very important topic at the moment because there are many films in which various languages are being spoken, films like Babel, for instance. And how do you dub this if you have 5 languages, or film like Inglourious Basterds, where you have 4 or 5 languages being spoken, and if you dub that into just one language, what happens if you do that, and what is the best way of translating these films? And beyond work, there's been quite a lot of work on translating norms or conventions that work in the target culture, as well as within the source culture, and the translation of ideological elements. There's a lot of work done on that, for instance, in Spain, and cultural elements. Censorship is quite an interesting topic in itself, and there's a little bit written also on the history of dubbing. So, media constraints, how words work when you translate them, and issues that go beyond words to know about culture aspect. And what interests me most is what I call other approaches, which is the use of multimodality, because we know that films are not only words, they are words which work with an audio track and a visual track, so they are an audiovisual medium. So because of that, we need to treat them in such a way. And there's been a lot of studies in the past that have studied film translation as you would study literature. So how words are translated, but not really taking into consideration the image and the sound. And this is what I want to do in my work. Now, dubbing in film studies, so if you want to, when I started to do my research, I wanted to see what has been done on dubbing in the film studies discipline, and there's not a lot that has been written about. I think it's fair to say that voice and dialogue in film studies have been overlooked in terms of research, and when I thought about dubbing, where should I start? Looking at voice and dialogue, what I thought was when I need to start from. So it's not to say that nothing has been written, it would be wrong to say that, but it's just that things either are being written as part of something else, and they are not the main focus of research. Of course, there's this major work by Michel Chion, published in France in 1982, translated into English in 1999,
that does look at voice, and it's a pioneering work on voice in cinema, but is more interested about the power of the human voice and the special relationship that exists between the voice and the cinematic image. Gendered voices in film screams the absence of voices, so is more interested in what voice means or what they are used for, rather than voice itself as, let's say, as an organ, for instance, like what is voice. And in film dialogue, Sarah Koslov, in her book over here in Film Dialogue, which is one of the main books in film studies, says that although what the characters say, exactly how they say it and how the dialogue is integrated with the rest of the cinematic techniques are crucial to our experience and understanding of every film since the coming of sound, canonical textbooks on film aesthetics devote pages and pages to editing and cinematography, but barely mention dialogue, because dialogue has been perceived too transparent and too simple to be studied. But we know that it's not that simple to translate dialogue. So I think there's an opportunity to do much more work on that and establish a dialogue between film studies and translation studies looking at translation. It's not to say that nothing is happening. Recently I saw this call for paper called Locating the Voice, which is going to be a book published in 2015 and then in the near future. And then we're going to have events, maybe conferences, to work on that. And they are particularly interested in the effects of sound in non-analog films, so they are interested in translation somehow, practices, effects, or reception of post-synchronized sound, textures and grains of the voice, which is something that I'm very interested in for my research. The relationship between the voice and the body, which is something I'm going to talk about today, and the vocal performance. So it's not to say that nothing is happening, it's just to say that maybe there's not as much as we would hope to have. Now, when I'm interested in dubbing, my starting point is performance, because I'm interested in the fact that when you're going to dub a film, because you're going to change the voice, you are going to alter one very important aspect of performance. And performance is defined as what the performer does in addition to the action, the function they perform in the plot, and the line they are given to say. Performance is how the action function is done, how the lines are said. So we are, in translation, we are interested in what is being said, but with performance, there is this emphasis on how. And for me, there's a link here with characterization, because the way we perceive characters, whether we're talking about, in literature as well, but in film, the way you understand a character is because of the performance of the actors. And I'm interested in that. And from a semiotic perspective, the signs of performance, so you have facial expression, voice, gesture, posture, and movements. So all very important things that we rely on to understand what a character is about. And this work on performance, I found is by the film studies scholar Richard Dyer, and he argues that the way we read performance signs is culturally and historically bound. He's not interested in translation, he never mentioned translation in his work, but I think that resonates into a translation context, because the way an American audience is going to understand a particular performance might be, and it probably is different from, let's say, a Chinese audience, and these are two maybe extreme culture, but even within Europe, we would have different understanding of performance because of our culture and our history. So my claim for my study is that dubbing, we have a direct impact on performance, because in dubbing you change not only what is said, but you change how it's said. And for performance and characterization. So we know the aspect of performance also includes the way people look like, what they wear. And if we look at this girl, I don't know if you can see her, we know who she is. You know who she is? The Little Riding Hood. I wish it was bigger. But then there are other performances of her. An actress is performing the Little Riding Hood, and we know who she is because of what she looks like. Then we have this guy that probably you know who he is. Yes, Dracula. And we know who he is because of what he's wearing, because of his facial expression, because of his hand movements. And he's being performed by different actors, and we know who they are. Well, maybe the second one you can't really see and you don't really know. It's from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But when this episode starts in Buffy, you know who he is because of what he's wearing and his facial expressions. Then also, because I'm talking about voice, so characters, for instance, actors, Leonardo DiCaprio, for instance, in Django. Leonardo DiCaprio is from America, but he's from Los Angeles, apparently. I don't know him, but I think that's where he's from. And when he speaks in this film, he's putting on a specific accent, which is an accent from the South, a thousand accent from America. And so he's doing voice work for that. And his real life persona is different from what he's acting because of who he's playing, so because of his performance and the voice that he has. Another character from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, this vampire, Spike, is an American actor, but he's putting on an English accent. So his performance is performing a British vampire, and to do that, he has to change his voice, he has to put on an English accent. So then you wonder what could happen in translation. And Marilyn Monroe, that we know for being this very sexy woman with a breathy voice, and also these people, we know who they are, or maybe you don't know them all, but you can maybe think of for you actors, performances that you know, and you know who these people are because of the way they speak, which is a very important aspect of performance. So talking about voice in a little bit more detail, there are studies, in film studies, that look at voice, but nothing is done in great depth. They're talking about, let's say, performance or aspect of mise en scène in a film, and they mention performance. So you have, for instance, Susan Smith, who's looking at what she called moments of vocal releases. That's when someone is going to tell you something specific about their life story, for instance, and the moment where the truth is going to come out is going to be a moment of vocal release, and she studies how they are performed. Andrew Cleven is looking at performance in general, and once in a while he talks about voice. And Roland Barthes, who is not a film studies person, but is post-structuralist, and his work has been used in film studies, talk about the grain of the voice. And he says that every performer has in his or her voice a reminder of their body, and that he calls the grain. And I think that's quite an interesting concept to think about, because in dubbing you're going to change that relationship between the body and the voice. So what happens to the grain? In audiovisual translation, there have been a few studies, for instance, on the challenges of regional, social, and dialectal varieties of language, and how to deal with that. They mention voice. Mangan is a recent study on Inglourious Basterds, and she's looking at how the film has been dubbed into French, and she mentions a little bit the voice of Brad Pitt, who is putting on a specific accent, and she's comparing his voice with the French actor that has been chosen. And Montpellier, which is a masterpiece from last year, 2 years ago, where she looks at paralinguistic information. She's looking at How I Met Your Mother and how it's been dubbed into Spanish, and she's looking how intonation is there to his translation. So it's not to say that nothing is being written on voice, but what I was looking for specifically was, because my claim or my belief is that voice is part of our identity. So if I had a different voice, I wouldn't be the same person, but that's what I tell myself. But I think there's something about that. But there's nothing much written about voice being identity. And one of the work I found is by this philosopher called Mladen Doller, where he talks about voice. He looks at voice from various perspectives, so from the philosophical, the metaphysical, and he says very interesting things about the voice being our identity. And for me, it was a way to put into concept what I think is that words mean more than what is said on paper. It takes the human voice to infuse them with deeper meaning. So, what I find quite interesting, particularly when you talk about dubbing, is this relationship between the body and the voice. And Doller says that voice is what bodies and languages have in common. It is their missing link, and language is attached to the body through the voice. So, language and body, and this voice is this very important element that makes it all together. And he says that voice is not part of linguistic, it's not part of the body either. It floats, and it is at the intersection of language and the body. So if we believe him and we think if the voice is the link which ties the signifier to the body, and if it's precisely the voice that holds bodies and language together, so if there is no voice without a body, where does it leave us with dubbing? Because when we dub, we completely change the voice. So we change the parameter of a person's identity. So when you think about this, for instance, for me dubbing, you can say the voice you hear is not my speaking voice, it's somebody else that is speaking on your behalf. It can work for you, or sometimes it doesn't work for you. But in France, for instance, we have this lady called Isabelle Gardien, who's doing the voice of Kate Blanchett, Emily Watson, and Julianne Moore. But Julianne Moore is also dubbed by this lady, and by this lady, and by this other lady. So it's quite interesting to see there is one woman with one voice, but in French, she got 4 voices. Or this handsome man, Jean-Pierre Miquel, is dubbing Brad Pitt, is dubbing Keanu Reeves, and is also dubbing Jude Law. Or other handsome men, I should say. But Jude Law is English, and they all have different types of voices. I mean, I recently went to see the Grand Budapest Hotel, and it starts with a voiceover narration by Jude Law, and I didn't know that, but I heard the voice and I thought, oh, that's Jude Law. And if it's dubbed, well, you don't know that, but maybe, is that important? Is that not important? For me, it is. This gentleman, Ned Hondo, is doing the voice of Morgan Freeman, Eddie Murphy, and Lawrence Fishburne. So we have, obviously there are fewer voice actors in France than there are actual actors, but I find it quite interesting when you think about voice and identity, to think about all that. And since we are talking about films, I'll just have you hear Marilyn Monroe when she speaks English and when she speaks French, just for you to get a little sound, if it works.
Wait a minute. Are you here? Louis, would you ask Mr. Esmond to come back to our dressing room? He's sitting in his usual place.
What's the rush? He's not going to run away.
I know, but I just can't wait.
For what? To us?
Didn't you notice? It's pocket for his ball chain.
That could be a bag of gumdrops.
No, because it's square.
So you can hear her voice, really kind of sexy, things like that. And then you have a friendly voice.
You're the petit peu. Louis, demandez à ce CSMO de venir dans notre loge. Oui, il est à sa place habituelle.
Jingle, mademoiselle.
I mean, that's enough, I think. I have to say that
I don't want, my research is not about criticizing and this is bad, this is awful, and we all have this kind of judgments. And sometimes it happens, and that's a case where it does happen. When you hear Marilyn Monroe in that film, and actually Marilyn Monroe has 3 voices in France. And for this one, it's this lady dubbing her. And other voices are much more successful in rendering the characteristic of her voice. But in this one, she does sound a little bit peremptory, a little bit nasal, and throaty at the same time. And she doesn't sound how we know her, if we know her from the original. And for me, that's what dubbing does. This situation where you have 2 strangers meeting and wondering who they are. They all think they are who they think they are, but obviously something else is happening. And Sigmund Freud talks about these moments when when you see something that you thought you knew, but you don't, or the other way around. And I think that's what dubbing does to you, when you either discover the original voice of an actor. When I first discovered that Sean Connery had a Scottish accent, that really destabilized me, because I thought, well, I didn't think he was French, but you suspend disbelief. He's been talking French, for so many years. And suddenly he speaks with a Scottish accent, and I thought, this is awful, but it's his real voice. Bless him. Or the other way around, when you are English speaking, you are used to the voice of the actors, and you travel and you watch that film and you hear the new voice, you somehow can't really believe that this is the actual person speaking. So Freud talks about this. Well, he doesn't talk about this for dubbing, but he talks about something he calls uncanny, these moments where we don't know what is really real and what is not. Just like when you wake up and you have dreams and you're not sure if that happened or not, or when you have some déjà vu situation. So I think for me dubbing does something like that. And I put a picture of someone with a doll there, a dummy, because in a way, there is sort of a ventriloquism happening, where you have a body and you have somebody else's voice. Almost like a ghost inhabiting or possessing the new body. And that could be a good horror film. So for me, dubbing is a case in point to rethink the relationship between the voice. So it's not only about me rethinking how to analyze dubbing, but also to raise question of identity about dubbing and the voice. So this is why my research is called Uncanny Encounters, Dubbing and Performance. And in this research, I'm interested, I want to create a multimodal model that I will use to analyze performance and characterization, and for that I will look at facial expressions, the voice, but also body postures, because the way you stand, the way you sit, the way you have your arms can be very different. So from Don Draper in Mad Men looking very, very sure of himself to, you can see Bella from Twilight feeling quite awkward between 2 men at the cinema. Sometimes you don't need words, you just see and you get an impression. And body movements, of course. So what I do for my research, it's a transdisciplinary approach where I've got film analysis, linguistic analysis, and voice analysis, and I want to see how they marry together because we all agree that sound is important, visual is important, words are important because it's translation, but how does it work? Because even in the example of Marilyn Monroe, she's been very successful in France. Everybody thinks that she's a beautiful, sexy woman. Well, not everybody, but that's the consensus. But still, she has this voice that is. So I wonder how these things add up, combine together for the analysis. So for voice analysis, my work has been influenced by work by someone called Van Leuven, who looks at sound, but he looks at the semiotics of sound, so what sounds mean. This other person called Al Berger, who is a voice coach. So he's giving you, if you want to be a voice artist, he gives you advice on how to do that. So it's very helpful for me to get vocabulary on how to describe the voice and learn quite a few things about placing the voice. And the work of John Wayne that I presented before. So I'm interested in the pitch of the voice, the range of the pitch, but also the level. I do an analysis that look at vowels and consonants. Consonants, so vowels, where they are placed in the mouth, for instance, if in terms of frontality, height, or aperture, which would have an impact when dubbing, for instance, in close-up, because languages work differently. So you may have certain vowels that will have a certain amount of movement, but then when you are going to dub, you're not going to be able to have that. Consonants, the manner, the way they are placed, so they are plosive and fricatives and nasal consonants that we all have. They have a shape, but they may also have a meaning. So it may be important to translate them and how they are voiced. The voice qualities, so breathiness, for instance, Marilyn Monroe, the tension that is in a voice, the roughness, the smoothness, the loudness or the softness, all these elements that can be used to describe voices. Placement, I think that's quite an important one, because depending on where you place your voice, so if you place it in the chest, or if you placed it coming from the nose, your voice is going to resonate differently, so that may be important to take into consideration. And tempo, and all this can be used to describe all these voices that we know. So Robert De Niro, for his fast speech, gangster speak in a lot of his films, or Arnold Schwarzenegger because of his German accent when he speaks English. Forgot her name. Lost in Translation girl. Scarlett Johansson. That has a very specific voice, and that's in different ways that people who speak the language. Marge Simpson, she's known for this horse throaty voice, Eddie Murphy, and so on. So that's the voice analysis. The film analysis is done because if you have different techniques and angles, camera angles, and so on, you are going to be given access to the world of the character in different ways. So if you have a long shot or if you have a big close-up, that is going to be very different in terms of how you understand the character, but also how it will have an impact on the dubbing, because if you have characters in the background, you may not have to be very close for lip synchronization, but if you have a very close-up, very big close-up, which has this one, then it might be important. Then camera and lens movement, because depending on the way the characters are shown to you, you are also going to understand things in a particular way, and that may have an impact on performance. And shot angles, because if you have a low shot angle and an eye level or a high shot angle, the same facial expression can take another meaning. So I think we can say that if a character is quite smiley, but when he's on a high angle, I think he almost looks threatening somehow. So it's important to add that to the analysis, because the camera may convey something that you may not have to convey in words, for instance. So moving on to words, linguistic analysis. My linguistic analysis is on systemic functional grammar, because I found that quite useful in the past. So Heide says that it's systemic and functional because languages work as systems, and there are functions that we realize when we speak, and then there is a whole grammar behind it. And he's quite known for his register analysis, where he looks at the field, so what is being talked about in a text, because he's using that for text mainly. The mode, how things are conveyed, so how languages is formed, and the tenor, and that has to do with the relationship between the reader and the speaker, but also for film or literature between characters. And he has meta functions. I won't go into too much detail about that, but the two that I find important is the interpersonal meta function, where you look at modality, because all these words like may, could, or might, or must, or have to, or should, they convey information about the relationship that people have. So it's interesting to study how people speak in the original and then see how this can be translated. It gets even more complicated when you have languages that are very different and don't share this aspect of modality. Aspects such as tu and vous, which we have in French to talk about. So if I'm close to someone, I will use tu for you. But if I don't know this person, I will use vous, and that is important when it comes to understanding the relationship between the characters. And the other aspect is transitivity, so that's things to do with active voice and passive voice. So you stole the cookie from the cookie jar is active, whereas the passive is the cookie was stolen from the cookie jar. And that gives you a certain, what Hallyday claims that you have choices when you speak. So if you choose to use an active, you are putting yourself in the position of the actor, and you're acting on an object or on a person. But if you use the passive, this may be because you don't want people to know that you stole the cookie, or maybe something more important. So I want to bring together the analysis of film, linguistic, and voice to have a multimodal analysis. Now the last thing that I want to mention, we're almost getting there, 5 minutes, is I'm interested, of course, in setting up this method, and it's quite analytical, and that's all very fine, but I don't want to forget that I'm watching a film, and there is pleasure involved, because, well, I think films, I mean, sometimes you don't only watch them for pleasure, but there's an entertaining aspect of film that I find important. And in art history, the word is from music. It's a music scholar, Antoine Ignon, and he tells us that in art history, taste has been recognized to be something that is not separate from works of art. It's not possible to distinguish between the two. So what is being tasted cannot be separated from who tasted it. And I think that's important when you watch films as well. And he's talking about a pragmatic view of the act of tasting, and such a pragmatic aims at restoring the performative nature of the activity of taste instead of making it an observance. Tasting is understood as a performance, it acts, engages, transforms, and it is felt. So my work, although I've tried to anchor it in many fields and I'm trying to have a scientific approach to what I am doing, takes into consideration viewing as a performance, because works make the gaze that behold them, and the gaze makes the works. So the implication that is I'm aware that there is subjectivity in my analysis, but the method itself is maybe has some subjectivity into it because I've chosen this particular topic and I've chosen what I'm looking at. But the method is transferable in the sense that you could use it to look at other material. The analysis is my own and the results are my own. And I think that doesn't make the research less interesting. I think that makes it even more interesting. So where do we go from here? My work, therefore, is setting up a multimodal model to analyze audiovisual material with emphasis on performance and experiences, because taste, pleasure, and effects are not exogenous variables of automatic attributes of objects. They are the reflective result of a physical, collective, and equipped practice regulated by methods that are themselves constantly revised. So the emphasis is on the method. And the results, where I want to try to engage in this conversation between film and translation studies because they don't talk very much, and I quite like talking. And also, there is work at the moment in audiovisual translation by Pablo Romero Fresco, who's working on accessible filmmaking. Now, Agnieszka is going to tell you all you need to know about accessibility. But Pablo is looking at the film process and at audio description and subtitle for the deaf and hard of hearing, and he claims that these films that will be audio described or subtitled for the deaf and hard of hearing, there needs to be in the production process and even in the pre-production process translation taken into consideration, because if these films are going to be audio described, if that's the only way that viewers can access them, translation needs to be taken much before. And I want also to think about this for dubbing, because films make millions of money, not only in the languages that they are shot in, but if we think about American cinema, all these films are dubbed all over the world. And you have directors, for instance, like Tarantino, who, when he released *Inglourious Basterds*, said this film should not be dubbed. Well, the film has been dubbed. And I'm not against dubbing. I think dubbing is very important to have. We can't. I think the ideal situation is that all modes of audiovisual translation are done, and we can choose, because some of us cannot read, for instance, and we need to have the dub, or some of us don't like reading films, and that's fair enough. But then, if dubbing is going to be made in an ideal world, I think it should take into consideration a lot of the aspects that I've spoken about. I do have a short clip to show. Do I have time to show the clip?
It's nothing to do with me. It's a Kickstarter campaign, because there is this director who wants to make a documentary about all the voices of George Clooney in the world. And I thought it's an interesting. So I'm not asking you to fund this campaign. It's just looking at it from a research perspective. Actually, it's doing quite well.
Weißt du, was mein Problem ist?
Hab ich denn nur eins?
Du hast zu viele Menschen um dich bekommen.
Deve essere umgekehrt. Ci vede una cosa, qualsiasi cosa.
Hi!
The internet is failing us.
I am not George.
No, you are not George Clooney. Well, we can maybe leave it to but. Is that the word? We're going to leave it on buffer, and maybe we can go back to it if you want to know more about George Clooney. But for the time being, I want to say thank you
For listening to me. And if you have any questions, please ask.
Thank you, Charlotte, for the presentation.
and I open the floor to questions. You're welcome.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. And I would like to ask you about the possibilities of researching the perception of voice in different cultures. Are you going to have some focus groups to research how they are taken in, let's say, English and French, or what other methods, practical methods of research? Thank you.
I think the book itself that I'm writing on is more about the methods than it is about the results. But further work is something that I would be interested in doing, to see how people feel when they actually listen to voices. But they are not, it's not done very much, so I would have to start from scratch. And I think maybe it's part 2 of the project. But I would encourage everyone to do this with their own languages. That would be interesting. I think it would be interesting to have a project that looks at one actor or 2 and have people from various dubbing countries and look at all the various voices that have been used. But it's not happening yet. Maybe we can do it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this really great presentation about voices. I would like to ask you, haven't you researched or don't you know about the situation when, say, a Hollywood actor knows the dubber of his character in France, and don't you know the reaction of Hollywood actors to the dubbers, to the voices? Do they like the voice?
I don't know of any specific cases. I mean, when I was studying Buffy the Vampire Slayer, I read some of the commentaries of the series. Some of the actors were saying how strange it was for them to hear themselves speak French, and also the fact that they have different names, well, not completely different, but there's a character called Xander, and he's Alex in French, and they were, because Alexander, maybe, but they didn't translate the other character's name. But so they were saying, this is strange, but they were not really, I think there are more, you can find more information on how certain directors feel about the dubbing, rather than actors themselves commenting on the dubbing. But I'm sure there is information on the internet about this. Do you know of any?
No, I was asking you.
No? Do you know of any? Nobody? Something else to look at. Oops, I have to click here. And I'm sure it's something very nice. Maybe we'll be able to watch this clip before the end of the morning. Any more questions?
Well, I want to thank you again. We enjoyed every minute of your presentation. Well, but actually, those performance signs you spoke about, not all of them refer to linguistics.
No.
Well, that is this interdisciplinary approach you need. But still, some of them have been studied from the semiotic perspective, and they are meaningful.
Yeah.
But voice seems to be quite a new object of research, well, as you mentioned, and a very complex one.
Yeah.
So some part of it has relevance to linguistics, like you mentioned, separate sounds, well, but some seem to be rather physical parameters. Well, I wonder if in your research you differentiate linguistic and non-linguistic approaches and the parameters or aspects, and whether you deal with such an issue as sound symbolism. It's seems to be relevant. No?
Well, I do. I haven't talked about. I haven't talked about this now. But I do. I want to take that into consideration. I think what I find what's difficult with my work is that because it hasn't been done really before, there's so many things that I could be including, and I probably will miss on being completely comprehensive because I don't think I can do that. So I will hope that I can pick up on aspects after I have presented what I think for me is more like a stepping stone, into doing research like that, and hoping that I can get some feedback from other researchers, also from film studies or voice studies, to make it even more comprehensive. But I think, yeah, there is a lot to take into consideration, and the semiotics of sound. I mean, Van Leeuwen talks about that, and it's my main source for that. And it is very subjective as well, because what the sound represents, it varies because of who we are, and also because of where we're from. So for us, maybe in the West, a high-pitched voice or a nasal voice is something that we have negative connotations with, but if you go to China or if you go to Japan, for them a high-pitched voice, a nasal voice, doesn't have this negative connotation. So it's a very complex thing.
Thank you. And you talk about the John movie, where the main actor, actually the leading, the Leonardo DiCaprio, who is in leading role, speaks different accents and speaks in different dialects of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But should we consider the dubbing system in other English-speaking countries? For example, to broadcast the movie in Australia or United Kingdom. Should we translate them, or should we leave it as it is? Thank you.
I think it probably depends on the movie and the intended meaning of the author. I know that there are Trainspotting, for instance, I think was subtitled for American audience because the Scottish dialect could not be understood over there. I think it's a delicate situation. I think there are probably situations, maybe if it's a documentary, maybe that would be okay to do that. But if it's a film that is has accents as part of all these languages, like multilingual films, if it is an important aspect of the original, then if you change, translation is change anyway, and there is no such thing as perfect equivalence, and we do the best we can. And I'm not claiming that it's actually possible to. I find that translating most of the time is impossible if you want to keep everything that was in the original. So I think there should be, for every film, if that's possible, there should be a translation technique that should be adapted depending on what the film is about. I don't know how people feel if Leonardo DiCaprio in Italian was dubbed with a Sicilian dialect. There are people writing about that, translating dialect and what makes sense to do. And it's very difficult to do that because if you're going to find a dialect that actually exists in the country in which it's dubbed, you may give connotations to the character that not actually the original, what was the intended connotation of the original. But I think in terms of translating dialect, what people who write on the topic say is that
you have to understand what is the function of the dialect in the original and try to reproduce it in the translation. And most of the time they don't do it using a similar dialect, but they change register, for instance, or vocabulary or things like that. But dubbing with another dialect can have connotations that may not be applicable. Did I answer your question? Yes?
We can take one more question, please.
Thank you for a very impressive presentation. I don't have a question. Are there many cases, or is actually there is a practice that, for example, a movie was shot and after it was dubbed for other, like foreign languages, and 10 years passed, 20 years passed, and the same movie was redubbed, right? So the very connection between the dubbing and the chronotop, right? So is there an evolution in the dubbing practice? Thank you.
I don't think there is an evolution in the dubbing practice.
The techniques?
In the techniques, I think it's quite, they've been doing the same thing for many years. I think one of the, in research, there are a lot of people talking about this aspect of dubbing that is called the bees, and the fact that the word that they use or the intonation that people have is not the actual intonation that people have in real life, or even the register of the vocabulary. Many times we will say, we don't really say that in French, or we don't say that in Italian, for instance. And there is something with dubbing, particularly in certain countries like Italy, where there's a lot of lobbying around dubbing, and it's quite protected, and the way they do things is the way they want to do it, and they don't want to change. So I think it's quite monolithic. It's not monolithic in a way it's done, because various countries have different ways of doing it. So in Italy, apparently they are less interested about lip synchronization than they are in Germany or in France. So they're more interested in what is actually said. So whereas in France, they pay a lot of attention on lip synchronization. So it's not monolithic like that, but I think it's quite conservative in the way it's being done. But I think things change because of fandubs and people on the internet posting dubbing that they have done themselves, and it can go from being very rudimentary to being quite good. And things are evolving because I think fans and people are doing it the way they would like it to be done. And who knows, maybe in the future things can, like the professionals can integrate what is being done by non-professionals to get to a better picture of them.
Maybe we can try finishing with a